What if the only thing standing between you and death was a simple meow in the middle of the night? Danger can lurk where we least expect it, invisible, silent, deadly. Often, there are no warnings. No time to react. But that night, when all seemed lost, a small cat did the impossible. Without understanding what was happening, without knowing what carbon monoxide was, she sensed what no one else could. This is the story of Winnie, the cat who didn't hesitate when her family was on the brink of disaster. A story of instinct, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. By the end of that night, one thing was clear. Heroes can come from where we least expect them. Not every story of heroism begins with a grand event. Some start subtly, almost unnoticed, in the quiet moments of everyday life. That's how Winnie became part of the Kiesling family. Kathy had always had a special love for cats. Since childhood, she had found comfort in their quiet presence and gentle companionship. So when she learned that a local shelter had a litter of rescued kittens, she knew the time had come to bring a new member into their family. Her husband agreed, and their teenage son, at first indifferent, soon warmed up to the idea. When they arrived at the shelter, they were greeted by the soft meows of kittens longing for a home. But it was Winnie who caught Kathy's attention. Small, with soft fur and curious eyes, she wasn't the most energetic of the group. She wasn't the most eye-catching either. But there was something about her, a quiet presence, an attentive gaze, as if she could see beyond what was in front of her. And when Kathy picked Winnie up for the first time, the little cat simply curled into her arms, purring deeply, as if she already knew she had found her place. And just like that, Winnie was adopted. In the months that followed, she became a constant presence in the house. Unlike many independent cats, Winnie liked to be close, watching everything with an almost protective awareness. She followed Kathy around the house, curled up beside her husband while he worked in his home office, and had a special bond with their teenage son. Every morning, without fail, she climbed onto his bed and woke him up with gentle taps on his face, a mix of affection and playful persistence. The Kiesling household was always a peaceful place. Well-defined routines. Family dinners. Lazy evenings spent watching TV, Winnie curled up on the couch beside them. She never demanded attention, but she was always there. If someone was sad or exhausted, she would quietly approach and lie down beside them, offering the silent comfort that only animals can give. To them, Winnie was more than a pet. She was family. A beloved presence that made everything feel warmer, safer, more complete. But no one could have imagined that, on one silent night, this little cat would become the only thing standing between life and death. Night fell quietly over the Kiesling family's home. Outside, the cold wind whispered through the trees, rustling the dry leaves in the garden. Inside, everything was at peace. Kathy and her husband were already in bed, deep in sleep, while their teenage son rested in the room next door. Winnie, as usual, walked slowly through the house, checking every corner before settling down to rest. But that night, something was different. The danger didn't come from a strange noise. It wasn't an unexpected intruder. It was invisible. It had no smell. No color. A silent killer was spreading through the air, carbon monoxide. An imperceptible leak had begun to fill the house, making every breath more dangerous than the last. The gas crept through the cracks, seeping into the family's lungs without them realizing it. Slowly, the effects began to take hold. Kathy's husband was the first to succumb, his body sinking heavily into the mattress, as if he had simply drifted into a deeper sleep. In the next room, their teenage son also breathed slower and slower, slipping into a lethargy he wouldn't wake from on his own. Carbon monoxide was doing its work silently, shutting them down one by one, without a single warning, without a single chance to fight back. But Winnie felt it. In the dead of night, her eyes suddenly opened. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy. Her breathing was strained. Her heart raced. An uneasy sensation spread through her body, something she didn't understand, but couldn't ignore. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her fur standing on edge with an instinctual tension. She paced through the house, sniffing the air, trying to make sense of what was happening. Everything was too still. The absence of movement from her humans made her uneasy. Where was the slow, familiar rhythm of their breathing? Why did the silence feel so absolute? And then, Winnie knew she had to act. Without hesitation, Winnie ran to Kathy's room. She jumped onto the bed, pressing her small paws against her owner's chest, trying to wake her up. First, a gentle tap. Then, harder. But Kathy didn't move. A sense of urgency took over Winnie. Her heart pounded, and her breathing grew more labored. Something was very wrong, and time was running out. So she did something she had never done before. She opened her mouth and let out a loud, insistent meow. A sound that pierced through the heavy silence of the house. She clawed at the sheets, nudged Kathy's face with her paws, desperate to pull her out of the haze. Kathy let out a faint groan, shifting her head slightly. But it wasn't enough. Winnie couldn't stop now. She meowed again, even louder, even more urgent. Her claws gripped the blankets, her eyes fixed on her owner, waiting for any sign of consciousness. Finally, Kathy began to wake up. Her body felt heavy. Her mind was foggy. Even the simple act of opening her eyes took an immense effort. Everything spun around her. But amid the confusion, she heard something persistent. A sharp, urgent meow. Something deep inside her told her she had to react. Slowly, her brain began to process the situation. She felt Winnie pressing against her chest. She saw the cat's blurred silhouette in the darkened room. The air was thick, her head throbbed. And then, like a bolt of lightning, the truth hit her. Something was terribly wrong. Her labored breathing. The numbness in her body. The darkness closing in. And then, it hit her. Her husband and son still hadn't woken up. Reality hit Kathy like a crashing wave. Her chest rose and fell with difficulty, her muscles felt heavy, as if every movement demanded impossible effort. The world around her spun, her mind clouded by a thick fog, her vision blurred. But the terror in her chest grew stronger when she realized. Her husband and son were still motionless. They hadn't woken up. Kathy's heart pounded. What was happening? Why did she feel so weak? Fear sliced through her like ice. She tried to call out to her husband, but her voice came out as a weak, hoarse whisper, barely audible. But Winnie was still there. Her eyes locked onto Kathy's, her ears low, her body tense, as if she understood that every lost second could be fatal. The cat paced back and forth across the bed, pressing her paws against Kathy, as if saying, "Get up. Now." Gathering every ounce of strength she had left, Kathy reached for the edge of the mattress and forced herself up. The room spun violently, but she couldn't stop now. Her instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. The impact made her vision flicker, and for a moment, darkness threatened to consume her again. But then, Winnie jumped down beside her. She rubbed her head against Kathy's arm, meowing loudly, pulling her back to reality. Struggling for breath, Kathy crawled toward her husband, touching his cold, unresponsive face. She shook him, but he didn't react. Panic clawed at her chest as she turned toward the bedroom door. Knowing that her son was alone, in the next room, defenseless against whatever was suffocating them. With superhuman effort, Kathy staggered to her feet, stumbling toward the door. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the doorknob, struggling to turn it. Every step was a battle, but she pushed forward. In the hallway, the air was even heavier. Her breathing, shallow, uneven. The silence, absolute. She reached her son's room and pushed the door open. He lay on his side, his arms limp against the mattress. Motionless. Panic consumed her. Kathy threw herself onto the bed and shook him with everything she had left. No response. Winnie jumped onto the bed, rubbing her face against the boy, nudging him with her paws, trying to wake him. But he didn't move. Tears burned in Kathy's eyes. She couldn't leave them there. She couldn't lose her family. With the last spark of awareness she had left, she forced herself up, her legs weak, trembling, and stumbled toward the phone on the nightstand. Her fingers slipped as she tried to grip the receiver, but she managed to dial 911. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then, a voice came through the line. The emergency dispatcher. Kathy could barely speak. Her words came out in broken gasps, her breathing erratic. But it was enough. The dispatcher understood something was terribly wrong. The phone slipped from her hand. The distant sound of sirens was the last thing she heard. Before her vision faded to black. And then, silence. But Winnie was still there. She wasn't giving up. The distant wail of sirens pierced through the darkness, growing louder as they raced toward the silent house. Flashes of red and blue reflected off the windows, the screech of tires cutting through the stillness of the night. Within seconds, the eerie calm was shattered. Doors slammed open, and hurried voices echoed through the yard. Paramedics and firefighters rushed inside, their breaths catching as they felt the heavy, contaminated air. What they found was devastating. Kathy collapsed in the hallway. Her husband unconscious on the bed. Her son motionless in his room. Time was against them. The rescuers sprang into action. Oxygen masks were placed over the family's faces, heart monitors activated to check for vital signs. The carbon monoxide levels in the air were dangerously high. Had they arrived just minutes later, it might have been too late. Slowly, Kathy began to regain consciousness. The fresh oxygen filling her lungs brought a wave of confusion and fear. Her vision blurred, but she could make out the frantic movements around her. She felt firm hands gripping her arm, heard the muffled voices of paramedics working swiftly. Her dazed gaze shifted to her husband and son. They were being carried out on stretchers, receiving the same life-saving care. A surge of relief crashed over her. They were alive. But something was missing. Kathy's heart pounded. Her weak body tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. A deep unease crept over her, something was wrong. She searched frantically for the familiar small, furry presence beside her. As paramedics focused on stabilizing the family, firefighters began a sweep of the house. No one had noticed the cat. Time dragged on painfully as the firefighters searched every corner of the house. From the ambulance, Kathy watched with wide, desperate eyes. The fog in her mind fought against darker thoughts, but the silence was unbearable. What if Winnie was unconscious? What if she hadn't survived? Inside the house, a firefighter suddenly stopped, his flashlight illuminating a small figure in the corner of the son's room. Between a fallen curtain and a tipped-over piece of furniture, a tiny body lay curled up, motionless. The beam of light reflected off Winnie's pale fur. She didn't react. The firefighter rushed forward, carefully scooping her up in his arms. His footsteps echoed through the house as he carried her outside, handing her off urgently to the paramedics. They immediately began resuscitation efforts. A tiny oxygen mask was placed over Winnie's delicate muzzle, while a paramedic checked her weak heartbeat. The world around Kathy faded as she watched. Tears welled in her eyes. Even in her weakened state, her breathing quickened at the sight of Winnie, completely still. The one who had saved them all. Now fighting for her own life. The ambulance sped through the deserted streets, rushing Kathy, her husband, and their son to the nearest hospital. Oxygen masks still covered their faces, while heart monitors tracked their vital signs. Despite the relief of receiving medical care, a shadow of anguish darkened Kathy's thoughts. Even in her weakened state, her mind was somewhere else. Was Winnie still alive? With every second that passed, uncertainty grew inside her. The fear of losing her loyal companion tightened in her chest even more than the lingering effects of the poisoning. She knew that without Winnie, none of them might have survived. And now, the hero of that night was fighting for her own life. While the family was rushed into the hospital's emergency unit, Winnie was being transported in a separate ambulance, headed to a veterinary clinic equipped to treat severe poisoning cases. The cat's small, motionless body lay beneath an oxygen mask, her heartbeat slow, weak, as if she were on the verge of giving up. But the veterinary team refused to let that happen without a fight. At the hospital, doctors and nurses worked quickly to stabilize Kathy, her husband, and her son. For fluids, oxygen therapy, and constant monitoring were necessary to help their bodies recover from the poisoning. But despite the medical attention, Kathy's mind was elsewhere. She was waiting, desperately, for news about Winnie. Every time a doctor entered the room, she braced herself for an update. But there were no answers. Time crawled. The clock on the wall ticked away at a painfully slow pace. Her heart ached. If Winnie didn't make it, how could she live knowing her savior hadn't shared her fate? At the veterinary clinic, the tension was just as high. Veterinarians worked rapidly, administering oxygen and monitoring her vitals. Carbon monoxide was a ruthless enemy. Even after rescue, its effects could still be devastating. Minute by minute, the team closely observed Winnie, praying for a sign of improvement. Her lungs were weak. Her body exhausted. But there was hope. Small and fragile, she had already shown more strength than anyone could have imagined. Hours passed. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, a doctor finally entered Kathy's hospital room. She held her breath. And then, the news she had been waiting for. Winnie was responding to treatment. She was still weak, but improving. Her breathing was stabilizing, and slowly, her strength was returning. Tears streamed down Kathy's face. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted. She knew the recovery would be slow, for her family and for Winnie. But the most important thing was that they had all survived. That night could have been their last. But thanks to Winnie, a new day lay ahead. The days that followed were slow and careful. At the hospital, Kathy, her husband, and their son went through a gradual rehabilitation process, as their bodies expelled the last traces of carbon monoxide. The severe headaches and overwhelming fatigue gradually faded. But the gratitude for being alive remained in their hearts. Despite the relief of recovery, one question echoed in Kathy's mind. Would Winnie be okay? Every day, before even asking about herself, she desperately sought updates on the cat. The bond between them had grown even stronger. Without Winnie, there may not have been a second chance for the family. At the veterinary clinic, Winnie was also undergoing a long road to recovery. Her small lungs fought to regain their strength, and veterinarians monitored every breath, every heartbeat, watching closely for any progress or setbacks. But Winnie proved to be stronger than anyone imagined. Day by day, she began to respond. Her strength returned. And slowly, the spark in her eyes came back. Finally, the waiting was over. On the same morning that the Kiesling family was discharged from the hospital, a phone call brought the news they had been longing to hear. Winnie was ready to come home. Emotion filled the room. It was a moment of victory. A second chance for everyone. Hours later, gathered in the veterinary office, Kathy watched as the carrier was placed in front of her. Her heart pounded as, for the first time since that terrible night, her eyes met Winnie's. The cat, still a bit frail, lifted her head and let out a soft meow. As if she knew she had fulfilled her mission. The drive home was quiet, yet filled with meaning. The family now understood the true value of the small creature who had always been by their side. Silent. Attentive. Watching over them. And in the most critical moment, she had made a decision that changed everything. As they stepped through the front door, Winnie took her first hesitant steps into the familiar space. She sniffed the pillows, brushed past the sofa where she used to nap, and finally jumped onto Kathy's bed. As if nothing had changed. But everyone knew. Everything had changed. Kathy, her husband, and their son sat around her, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. Life had given them a second chance. And they knew exactly who to thank. Winnie wasn't just a cat. She was a hero. A beloved family member who had saved them from a fate that could have been tragic. From that day on, Winnie's story would never be forgotten. To the Kiesling family, every glance, every purr, every small gesture from their cat was a reminder of the night she proved that heroes can have 4 paws and giant hearts. The invisible danger was gone. But Winnie's love and courage would remain forever. Stories like Winnie's make us reflect on the true meaning of the bond between humans and animals. We often see them only as companions. But in unexpected moments, they reveal themselves as silent guardians, ready to protect us without hesitation. Winnie didn't know what carbon monoxide was. She didn't understand the invisible dangers that had filled her home that night. But she knew something was wrong. She knew her family needed her. And driven by an instinct beyond understanding, she acted. This story reminds us that heroism doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it takes the form of a persistent meow in the middle of the night. Of small paws that refuse to stop until someone woke up. The Kiesling family will never forget what happened that night. And for them, every day with Winnie will be a living reminder that in a moment of darkness, it was the love and intelligence of an animal that brought the light back. Because some lives are saved by doctors, first responders, firefighters. But others are saved by 4-legged heroes. And Winnie proved that to be a hero. All you need is a heart big enough to love without limits. What did you think of this story? If you liked it, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.